In the shadow of Los Angeles's most exclusive hills, where January's fierce Santa Ana winds howled through palatial estates, Rachel Thornton stood at her bedroom window clutching her golden retriever's worn leather collar. Max, her faithful companion of 12 years, pressed against her leg, his usual playful demeanor replaced by an anxious whimper. Below, the city was transforming into hell on earth. "It's okay, boy," Rachel whispered, but her trembling hands betrayed her fear. The wildfire that had started as a mere spark hours ago now painted the winter sky in apocalyptic orange. Ash rained down like toxic snow, coating her meticulously maintained 10-acre estate. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent millions fireproofing this mansion, yet nature seemed determined to test every penny of those improvements. The mandatory evacuation order had come through her phone for the third time in an hour. Rachel deleted it with the same determination she'd used to build her real estate empire. At 53, she'd weathered 3 divorces, countless business rivals, and the scathing judgment of LA's elite. This house wasn't just her home, it was her victory monument. "Mrs. Thornton!" Elena, her housekeeper of 15 years, burst into the room. "Por favor, we must go. The fire department says we have less than an hour." The panic in Elena's voice was raw, primal. Rachel turned, her designer silk robe swishing against marble floors that had been imported from quarries in Carrara, Italy, the same quarries Michelangelo had used. "Elena, take the rest of the staff and go. I've already called cars for everyone." She managed a small smile. "Max and I will be fine." "But Mrs. Thornton—" "That's all, Elena." Rachel's tone carried the same steel that had made her Los Angeles's most formidable real estate developer. As Elena reluctantly retreated, Rachel caught her reflection in a priceless Venetian mirror. Her carefully maintained blonde hair was perfect, her posture rigid with practiced grace. But her eyes held something she hadn't seen in them since the day her parents died and left her with nothing but debts and broken promises. Fear. The sound of sirens grew closer, their wail mixing with the roar of helicopter blades. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Rachel watched as her neighbors fled in luxury vehicles, their headlights cutting through the thickening smoke. Each passing car carried away another piece of the carefully curated world she'd built over 3 decades. In her vast walk-in closet, Rachel's gaze fell on the photograph she kept hidden behind her designer shoes. A shabby house in Reseda, with peeling paint and dying grass. Her first home, bought with scraped-together savings and a loan that had nearly broken her. She'd promised herself then that she would never be that vulnerable again. Max's sudden bark snapped her back to the present. The dog ran to the window, hackles raised. Outside, emergency lights strobed through the smoke as 3 fire engines ground to a halt in her circular driveway. Rachel watched as firefighters poured out, their movements urgent but coordinated. One figure stood out, tall, commanding, moving with purpose toward her front door. The security system chimed. Through the intercom, a voice cut through the chaos, deep, authoritative, and edged with barely contained fury. "Mrs. Thornton, this is Battalion Chief Jacob Harris. Either you open this door or we break it down. Your choice." Rachel's finger hovered over the intercom button. In the distance, a massive oak tree, one that had stood sentinel over her property for over a century, erupted in flames. The sight sent a shudder through her body, but she steeled herself. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the button. "Chief Harris, I appreciate your concern, but this house is built to withstand." "Ma'am," he cut her off. "I just watched a $5 million house with the same fireproof rating burn to the ground in less than 10 minutes. Outside temperature is climbing past 150 degrees. This isn't a debate." Something in his voice made Rachel pause. It wasn't just authority. There was pain there, old wounds that seemed to bleed into every word. Before she could respond, Max let out another bark, this one different. Worried. Rachel turned to find him pawing at the closet door she'd shut earlier, the one leading to the east wing where she kept her most precious valuables. "Max?" The dog whined, scratching more frantically at the door. That's when Rachel smelled it, not the general smoke from outside, but something closer. something inside. And inside, that would be Rachel. He looked at her. The uniform pulled a little tighter and pressed harder against his body. A new alert blared through her phone. Immediate danger, fire. Breach detached at East Wing. As realization dawned, Rachel's perfectly maintained world began to crack. She grabbed Max's collar and rushed toward the stairs, her heart pounding in rhythm with the emergency alerts now screaming through her home speaker system. She had a choice to make, and for the first time in decades, Rachel Thornton wasn't sure she held all the cards. The front door's heavy lock disengaged with a click that seemed to echo through her marble foyer. As she pulled it open, Rachel came face to face with Battalion Chief Jacob Harris. His eyes, hard as steel beneath his helmet, locked onto hers. But it wasn't judgment she saw there. It was recognition. The kind that only comes from someone who's watched their own world burn. "You've got 30 seconds to grab what matters," he said quietly. "Then we're leaving. All of us." Behind him, the night burned orange and red, a testament to nature's raw power. And in that moment, Rachel Thornton, queen of Los Angeles real estate, self-made millionaire, notorious for never backing down, felt something she hadn't experienced since that first shabby house in Reseda. The humbling weight of knowing that some things can't be controlled, only survived. The East Wing erupted in flames just as Rachel and Jacob reached the main foyer. The force of the explosion shattered windows, sending shards of custom-made glass raining across Italian marble. Max barked frantically, pulling Rachel toward the grand staircase as smoke began pouring through the halls. "My safe room," Rachel gasped, trying to turn back. "Everything I have. Documents, deeds, my mother's jewelry." Jacob grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not unkind. "Look at me, Rachel." His use of her first name cut through her panic. "I've seen that look before. 20 years ago, in my own eyes, watching my house burn with everything I owned inside. Trust me, none of it is worth your life." A massive wooden beam crashed behind them, spraying embers across the foyer. Through the smoke, Rachel caught a glimpse of her reflection in the falling Venetian mirror. No longer the polished real estate queen, but a woman on the edge of losing everything, just like she'd been in Reseda. When they reached the elevator, Jared touched her arm. "Chief Harris?" A firefighter burst through the front door, his face marked with urgency. "Winds shifted. The fire's creating its own weather system. We've got multiple vortexes forming." "Fire tornadoes," Jacob muttered, his expression darkening. "Rachel." "We're out of time." But Rachel had frozen, her eyes wide with horror. "Max!" The dog had bolted up the stairs, disappearing into the smoke-filled corridor leading to her private gallery. "He's trained to protect the house. He thinks he's doing his job." Before Jacob could stop her, Rachel broke free and ran up the stairs. The smoke burned her lungs, but decades of determination drove her forward. Behind her, she heard Jacob cursing, then his heavy footsteps following. "Rachel, stop!" His voice carried over the roar of the flames. "The structure's compromising." She ignored him, pushing through the thickening smoke. The gallery ahead housed her most precious possessions, original Picassos, rare manuscripts, the physical proof of every victory she'd ever claimed. But none of that mattered now. Somewhere in the inferno, Max was barking. Jacob caught up to her, his breathing heavy even through his oxygen mask. "This whole wing is going to collapse. We need to—" A sharp crack cut him off. Rachel looked up to see the ornate ceiling buckling above them. In that split second, Jacob moved with the instinct of someone who'd faced death before. He tackled her just as the ceiling gave way, shielding her body with his own as debris rained down around them. They landed hard, Jacob's protective gear taking the brunt of the impact. Through the chaos, Max's barking grew more desperate. It was coming from her private study, the room where she kept the only photo of her parents she had left. "My dog," Rachel coughed, struggling to her feet. "Please, he's all I have left." Something in her voice made Jacob pause. He pulled off his oxygen mask and handed it to her. "Put this on." His eyes, visible now, held a mix of frustration and understanding. You're not the only one who lost everything to fire. As Rachel breathed in the precious oxygen, Jacob's radio crackled. Chief, you've got 3 minutes max. The whole east face is going. What happened? Rachel asked, seeing the pain flash across Jacob's face. When you lost your home. Later, he growled, but his voice softened. If we survive this stupid stunt. He pulled out a spare emergency mask from his kit. Your dog, which room? End of the hall, the study. Rachel pointed through the smoke. There's a hidden door behind the bookcase. It's where I keep my most valuable. Save it, Jacob cut her off. You want to help? Start talking to your dog, keep him barking, and stay behind me. They pushed forward together, Rachel calling out to Max as Jacob cleared their path. The heat was intense now, making the air shimmer. Through the smoke, Rachel caught glimpses of her life burning. Photos, awards, the newspaper clipping from her first major development deal. Max's barks led them to the study, where flames had already begun consuming the rare first editions she'd spent years collecting. The hidden door to her secure room stood open, and inside Max stood guard over a small safe, the one containing her parents' photo and the deed to that first house in Reseda. When Max took out the little box, Max tapped the keeper. Max, come! Rachel's voice carried all the authority she'd ever possessed. The dog hesitated, torn between his training and his loyalty. Getting real hot in here, Rachel, Jacob warned, checking the ceiling. Whatever's in that safe, it's not about what's in it, Rachel said softly, finally understanding. Max, we're going home. The dog bounded toward her just as a tremendous groan filled the room. Jacob grabbed both Rachel and Max, pushing them toward the door as the study's walls began to cave in. They ran through the smoke-filled corridor, every step carrying them further from the empire Rachel had built and closer to a truth she'd spent years avoiding. Now, behind them, the east wing of Rachel Thornton's mansion collapsed in a roar of flame and fury, but clutched in her hand was the photo from the safe, a faded image of a young girl standing proudly in front of a shabby house in Reseda, her parents' arms around her shoulders, their smiles untouched by the weight of debt and broken promises that would follow. As they stumbled onto the front lawn, oxygen masks discarded, Rachel looked back at her burning mansion. The flames had transformed it into a cathedral of fire, its proud columns now torches against the night sky. Max pressed against her leg, no longer the guard dog but simply a faithful companion, grateful to be alive. You know what the worst part was? Jacob's voice was rough with smoke and memory. After my house burned, I spent years trying to rebuild exactly what I'd lost. Took a long time to realize that starting over doesn't mean going backward. Dawn broke over Los Angeles like a bruise, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of purple and gray. Rachel sat on the back of an ambulance, an oxygen mask covering her face, watching as firefighters continued their battle against the inferno that had been her home. Max lay at her feet, his fur matted with soot, refusing to leave her side even when the paramedics tried to check him for injuries. The evacuation center had been set up at the local high school, its gymnasium now filled with her neighbors, the same people she'd barely acknowledged at charity galas and homeowners association meetings. Some wore designer pajamas, others whatever they'd managed to grab in their rush to escape. All of them wore the same shell-shocked expression. Here. Jacob appeared beside her, holding out a paper cup of coffee. He'd stripped off his protective gear, revealing a face weathered by years of fighting nature's fury. A long scar ran down his left forearm, disappearing beneath his sleeve. Another story of fire and survival. It's terrible, but it's hot. Rachel accepted the cup with trembling hands. Why did you come back for us? The question had been burning in her mind, fiercer than the flames that still consumed her home. Protocol probably said to leave us. Protocol did say to leave you. Jacob sat beside her, his own coffee untouched. Remember that house I mentioned? The one I lost? He waited for her nod. It wasn't just the house. My mother was inside. She went back for our family photos. The weight of his words hung between them, heavier than all the smoke in the air. Rachel looked down at the single photograph she'd managed to save. Her parents in front of that humble Reseda house. Did she? No. Jacob's voice was rough. I got her out, but watching someone you love choose things over their own life, it changes you. Makes you see what really matters. He gestured toward the gymnasium. Those people in there? They all chose to live. A commotion near the gym's entrance drew their attention. Elena, Rachel's housekeeper, was arguing with a volunteer. Please, I must find Mrs. Thornton. She needs to know. Rachel stood, wobbling slightly. Jacob steadied her with a hand on her elbow as Elena rushed over, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Thornton, the Martinez family, they have nowhere to go. The shelter can only keep them 3 days, and with their little girl's medical conditions, the Martinez family. Rachel remembered them, the Gardner's family, who lived in the guest house at the edge of her property. She'd barely spoken to them in the 5 years they'd worked for her, seeing them as just another part of her carefully maintained estate. The daughter, Rachel said slowly, memories surfacing through the haze of smoke and exhaustion. She has diabetes. Elena nodded frantically. Type 1. They lost all her supplies in the fire. The insurance, it will take weeks to... She trailed off, wringing her hands. Rachel felt something shift inside her, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. She turned to Jacob. I need your help. Over the next few hours, Rachel Thornton, who had once measured her worth in square footage and auction prices, became someone else entirely. She worked the phones, calling in favors from doctors who owed her real estate deals. She emptied her emergency credit cards at pharmacies, securing insulin and supplies. When the shelter administrator tried to enforce the 3-day limit, she didn't wave her checkbook. Instead, she sat down and listened to his challenges, then helped organize a rotation of empty guest houses and vacant properties among her wealthy neighbors. You're good at this, Jacob observed, watching her coordinate with emergency services to establish a more permanent evacuation center. Better than you were at being the queen of the hill. Rachel paused, realizing she'd been using her designer scarf to wipe tears from a child's face. I used to be them, she said quietly. In Reseda, after my parents died, leaving nothing but debt. I swore I'd never be powerless again. Somewhere along the way, I confused power with possessions. The day wore on, and Rachel found herself doing things she'd never imagined. She sat with elderly neighbors, listening to their fears. She helped young parents keep their children distracted with stories and games. When a local news crew arrived, hoping to interview the famous Rachel Thornton about her lost mansion, she directed them instead to the volunteer coordinators who needed to get their message out. As evening approached, she found herself back outside, watching the sunset paint the smoky sky in impossible colors. Her mansion was still burning, its remains silhouetted against the dying light like the skeleton of her old life. Max dozed nearby, his head resting on the paw of a German shepherd, belonging to one of the displaced families. Your insurance company called, Jacob said, appearing beside her. He'd been off shift for hours but hadn't left. They're ready to start the claim process whenever you are. Rachel nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. Did you know the Martinez girl wants to be a firefighter? She told me while I was helping her check her blood sugar. 14 years old, and she's already thinking about how to help others. Funny how losing everything can help you find yourself, Jacob said softly. Rachel turned to look at him, really look at him, for the first time. The hardness she'd first seen in his eyes was still there, but now she recognized it for what it was. Not judgment, but the kind of strength that comes from being broken and rebuilding yourself into something stronger. I need to ask you something, she said. That house in Reseda, the one you lost with your mother's photos. What did you do after? A small smile touched Jacob's lips. I became a firefighter. Figured if I couldn't save my own past, I could help others protect their future. He paused, studying her face. Why? Rachel reached into her pocket, touching the edges of her parents' photograph. Because I think I finally understand what they were trying to teach me back then. It was never about the house. 3 months after the fire, Rachel stood at the edge of her property, watching construction crews clear the last of the debris. Spring had arrived early in Los Angeles, and green shoots were already pushing through the scorched earth. Nature's reminder that renewal always follows destruction. "The insurance company thinks I'm crazy," she said to Jacob, who stood beside her in civilian clothes, his shift at the station having ended an hour ago. Turning down their offer to rebuild the mansion. "Are you?" he asked, but the slight smile playing at his lips suggested he already knew her answer. Rachel watched as Max chased butterflies through the new grass, his playful barks mixing with the sound of construction equipment. "You know what I realized? Every room in that mansion was designed to keep people out. I had 3 separate security systems, 7 sets of electric gates, and a panic room that could withstand a nuclear blast." She shook her head. "I wasn't protecting myself. I was imprisoning myself." The plans spread out on the portable table before them told a different story. Where the mansion had once stood, Rachel had designed a complex of modern, sustainable townhomes. Solar panels, community gardens, and open spaces replaced the ornate fountains and manicured lawns of her former estate. "Half of them at below-market rates," she continued, running her finger along the blueprint. "Priority housing for first responders, teachers, and families displaced by the fires." She paused, looking up at Jacob. "The Martinez family will have the corner unit, the one with the extra room for Maria's medical supplies and study space for her firefighter training." Jacob nodded approvingly. "Your neighbors must love this plan." "Ha! Oh, they're furious," Richard laughed, but there was no bitterness in it. "The same people who were happy to use my guest houses during the evacuation are now worried about property values. But you know what? That woman I used to be, the one who cared more about property values than people, she burned away in that fire." As if to emphasize her point, a group of volunteers arrived for the day's work. Among them were faces that would have never graced Rachel's former social circle. Firefighters from Jacob's station, teachers from the local school, families who had lost homes in the fire. They came not out of obligation, but because Rachel had spent the past 3 months working alongside them, learning their stories, sharing their burdens. Elena approached, carrying a tray of coffee cups. She no longer wore a uniform. Rachel had promoted her to project coordinator for the new development. "Mrs. Thornton, the community center plans are ready for review, and the fire safety education program wants to know if you'll speak at their next session." "Rachel," she corrected gently. "Just Rachel." She took a cup, remembering how she used to drink only hand-ground imported coffee. The simple brew from the local diner tasted better somehow. "You know," Jacob said, accepting his own cup, "when I pulled you out of that mansion, I thought I was saving someone who needed to learn what mattered. Turns out, you just needed to remember what you already knew." Rachel touched the photograph in her pocket. Her parents, in front of the Reseda house. She kept it with her always now, not as a reminder of where she'd come from, but of who she'd always been meant to be. "I've been thinking about that day," she said. "When you told me about your mother going back for the photos. For years, I thought losing everything was the worst thing that could happen. But sometimes," she gestured at the bustling activity around them, "losing everything is just making room for something better." The sound of laughter drew their attention. Maria Martinez was showing a group of younger kids how to plant seedlings in the community garden plot. Her father, who had once been just the gardener, was now teaching sustainable landscaping to the volunteer team. "You know what's funny?" Rachel said, watching the scene. "That mansion had 32 rooms, and I was always alone. Now I'm building something half the size, and there's never enough space for all the people who want to help." Jacob's hand found hers, rough calluses meeting soft skin that was slowly developing its own signs of honest work. "That's the thing about community," he said. "It doesn't care about square footage." As the sun set over Los Angeles, casting long shadows across the construction site, Rachel gathered everyone for the daily end-of-work meeting. Standing there, surrounded by people who had become more than neighbors or volunteers, they were family now. She felt something she'd never experienced in all her years of real estate success. She felt rich. "My parents had a saying," she told the group, her voice carrying across the quiet evening air. "They said a house is made of walls and beams, but a home is built with love and dreams." She smiled at Jacob, at Elena, at the Martinez family, at all the faces that had become part of her new life. "They lost everything trying to give me a better life. And I spent years thinking that meant I had to build walls to protect myself. But now I understand. They weren't teaching me about building walls. They were teaching me about building bridges." Max barked in agreement, causing laughter to ripple through the crowd. As Rachel looked out over what would soon become a true community, not just houses, but homes, she realized that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones that can't be bought, sold, or burned away. So the fire that had destroyed her mansion had also burned away the barriers she'd built around her heart. In their place grew something stronger than marble columns and security systems. Connections, trust, purpose. Rachel Thornton, who had once measured her worth in square feet and dollar signs, now measured it in lives touched and communities strengthened. And as she stood there, with Jacob's steady presence beside her and Max's faithful devotion at her feet, she knew that she wasn't just rebuilding houses. She was finally, truly, building a home. It was the first time since walking away from Salmon Valley she realized